You've felt it. That shovel bites into packed clay and just stops dead. The edge rolls over, the blade folds, all that force jolts straight back up through your wrists. You bought the cheap one, and it bent on the first root. So you spent more on the premium model, and it barely did any better. Here's what should not be possible. A $20 shovel, modified in a single afternoon, slicing through roots and hardpan that folded a $140 spade like it was tin. I set out to crack exactly why. Because the answer was never the price tag. The answer was buried in an old Japanese blacksmithing method the tool aisle will never put on a label. It traces back to the smiths of Sanjo in the 1620s and a peening technique that's been documented for 400 years. And the best part is this. It works on the rusty, beat-up shovel already leaning in the corner of your garage right now. I still remember the exact moment it clicked. My back bench, a cold February morning, a $15 hardware store shovel I'd reground the night before. I dropped it onto an oak root as thick as my wrist, the same root that had bounced my expensive forged spade 3 times. It went through in one clean cut. I actually sat down on the bench and just stared at it. Something was very wrong with everything I thought I knew about tools. So let me walk you through exactly how I unraveled it. The first thing I had to do was kill my own assumption. Like you, I always believed the difference had to be the steel. The expensive shovel must be some superior alloy, some hardened wonder metal, and the cheap one must be soft garbage. That story is comforting because it justifies the money. So I decided to test it directly instead of trusting the marketing. I took 3 shovels, a $20 big box special, a $60 mid-range garden spade, and a $140 forged premium model that every review site swears by. I cut a sample off the edge of each blade and had the hardness checked. Now here's the part that stopped me cold. The cheap shovel came in around 130 on the Brunel scale. The premium one? Around 170. That's a real difference, sure. But it is nowhere near the gap between a tool that fails and a tool that dominates. To put that in plain terms, both of those blades are still soft, mild steel. Neither one is anywhere close to the hardness of a real cutting tool, which runs well over 500 on the same scale. So the expensive shovel isn't made of some magic alloy. It's the same family of low-carbon steel, just slightly better heat-treated. That 40-point difference in hardness cannot explain why one tool cuts and the other folds. The story I'd believed my whole life was a lie by omission. Therefore, the real cause had to be somewhere else entirely. If it wasn't the metal, then the thing separating a great digging tool from a useless one was something you could not see just by holding it in the store. And that's the moment the mystery actually got interesting, because it meant the advantage might be something you could add to any shovel, not something you had to buy. But I still had no idea what that something was. So I flipped both shovels over and looked at the one place nobody ever looks. The edge itself. Not the shape of the whole blade, not the shine of the metal, the tiny bevel where the steel actually meets the ground. And that is where I found the first real fingerprint of the crime. I put a protractor gauge against the working edge of every shovel I owned. The cheap one had almost no bevel at all. It was basically a blunt, squared-off end of a flat plate, sitting somewhere around 60 degrees of included angle, if you could even call it an edge. The premium shovel was a little better, maybe 45 degrees, with a rough ground face. Neither of them was sharpened the way any real cutting tool is sharpened. Both of them were, functionally, blunt clubs of steel, meant to be pushed through dirt by brute force. Now here's why that matters, and here's the first hard number that changed how I saw everything. When you take a blade from a 60-degree wedge down to a 30-degree wedge, you don't just make it a little sharper. You roughly halve the force needed to drive it into the same material. The physics of a wedge is unforgiving. The cutting force scales with the angle of the wedge. A fat, blunt edge doesn't slice the soil, it compresses it and shoves it aside, and every ounce of that resistance travels back up the handle into your shoulders. A thin, keen edge parts the ground like a knife through a rope. So I took the $20 shovel to the bench grinder and I reshaped the edge. I brought that included angle down from around 60 degrees to close to 35, with a long, clean bevel maybe an inch wide up the face of the blade. It took me about 20 minutes and cost me nothing but a little wear on a grinding wheel. Then I went back out to the same test bed of packed soil and roots. The difference was not subtle. The reground, cheap shovel was now biting deeper, with less of my body weight than the premium spade straight out of the box. I'd spent $0 extra and beaten a $140 tool on the single thing that actually matters for digging, which is how easily the edge enters the ground. Because the second I had a thin, aggressive edge, that edge started rolling and denting the moment it hit a stone. I'd made it cut beautifully, but now it was fragile. A thin edge on soft, mild steel is like a razor made of butter. It parts the soil, then folds the instant it meets anything hard. So the real puzzle wasn't just how to make a shovel sharp. It was how to make a thin edge that stays thin without collapsing. And that is exactly the wall the whole tool industry runs into, and exactly the wall the old Japanese smith solved 400 years ago. So I went digging, and this is where the trail led me to Sanjo. Sanjo is a town in Niigata, Japan, and around the 1620s, in the early Edo period, the farmers there started a side trade to survive the brutal winters and the flooding of the Shinano River. They made nails, then blades, then a whole ecosystem of hand-forged agricultural tools, and that region is still, right now, one of the most respected tool-making centers on Earth. These were not artists making museum pieces. These were dirt-poor farmers who needed a hoe and a digging blade that would not fail in the field, because a broken tool in planting season could mean a hungry winter. Necessity, not decoration, drove every technique they developed. And one of those techniques is the thing that finally broke the whole mystery open for me. It's a cold forging process. The Japanese smiths and the old European scythe makers who arrived at the same answer independently discovered that you can make the very edge of a soft steel blade dramatically harder without a forge, without heat, without any exotic equipment. You do it by hammering it. Cold. Here's the mechanism, and once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. Steel is a lattice of metal grains. When you strike that steel cold with a hammer, over and over along a thin line, you jam that crystal structure together. In materials science, this is called work hardening or strain hardening, and it comes from packing the metal with what are called dislocations until the grains can barely move. The metal at that edge gets harder, denser, and springier than the metal an inch above it. On mild steel, cold work like this can drive the surface hardness up by 50 to 100% in the worked zone. You are not adding any material. You are not buying better steel. You are rearranging the steel you already have into something tougher, right where it matters, along a strip you could cover with a pencil line. The scythe makers of the Alps called this peening, and they'd sit for an hour tapping the edge of a grass blade thin and hard with a small hammer against a tiny anvil before every mowing season. The Sanjo smiths built the same principle into the working edges of their digging and cutting tools. The result is an edge that is both thin enough to cut and hard enough to survive, which is the exact contradiction that had stumped me at the grinding wheel. They solved centuries ago the problem that a $140 modern shovel still hasn't solved. Now I need to talk directly to you, because I know exactly what you're thinking right now. You're thinking this all sounds great for someone with a real anvil, a forge, and a rack of fancy Japanese hammers. You're looking at the tired, rusty, half-bent shovel by your back door and thinking, that's not me. This won't work on my junk. So this next part is built specifically for you and that specific worn-out shovel, because that shovel is actually the perfect candidate. Here's why. You do not need an anvil. Any heavy, flat, hard steel surface works, the flat back face of a vise. A sledgehammer head clamped in that vise with the flat facing up. A chunk of railroad track, which people give away all the time. Even a thick steel plate set on a solid stump. You do not need a special hammer either. A regular ball peen hammer from any hardware store, the round end, is exactly the tool the job wants. If all you own is a claw hammer, the flat face will still do it, just more slowly. Total investment, if you have nothing, maybe $15 for a used ball peen hammer at a flea market. Here's the process, step by step, on your existing shovel. First, take that reground thin edge we talked about, or just clean up the factory edge with a file until it's bright bare metal along the last half-inch. Rust and paint have to go, because you need to see the steel move. Second, lay the very edge of the blade flat on your hard surface, with just the last eighth to quarter of an inch of the edge overhanging or supported solid. Third, take the ball peen and start tapping. Not swinging, tapping. Light, quick, overlapping blows. Walking steadily along the entire edge, keeping the hammer face flat and even. You're not trying to bend the blade. You're trying to densify a thin ribbon of steel right at the cutting line. And that's when the first wave of real anger hit me. Because here's the ugly part. Grinding a proper bevel on a shovel edge takes a factory about 20 seconds and a few cents of abrasive. They already have the machines. They already grind and stamp these blades by the thousand. Leaving that edge blunt is not an accident, and it is not a cost saving worth mentioning. Somebody, somewhere, decided that a shovel that works too well is a shovel you won't replace. They sell you the handle, the shine, the forged look, the brand name. They just quietly leave off the one thing that would make it cut. And you and I have been buying blunt steel and blaming our own arms for the struggle. If this way of thinking about tools resonates with you, the idea that the real knowledge was always there, just deliberately left off the label, I went much deeper on all of it in my books Tool Mind, Steel Instinct, and Tool Master. Each one picks up where a video has to stop, going through the geometry, the metallurgy, and the hands-on sequences in the kind of detail you can take straight to the bench. You'll find them linked in the description below, and I think you'll recognize the same voice you've been listening to here. But sharpening the edge only solved the first layer, and it exposed a much deeper problem. You'll actually feel it change. The first pass, the steel gives a dull tap. After several passes, the sound rises to a harder, brighter ring, and that ring is the sound of the metal work hardening under your hand. Walk the edge 3 or 4 full passes, then flip and lightly do the other face to keep it even. When you're done, take your file back and it will skate a little instead of biting easily. That's your proof. That edge is now measurably harder than the rest of the blade, and you did it on a beat-up shovel with a $15 hammer and a vise. No forge, no electricity, no new tool. And here is the beautiful side effect that the old scythe men knew and modern buyers have completely forgotten. A peened edge is field maintainable forever. When it dulls, you don't grind away metal and shorten the blade's life. You just repeen it, tapping the edge back out thin and hard again, the way those alpine farmers did every single season for decades on the same blade. You have turned a disposable tool into one you can renew with a hammer for the rest of your life. That alone is the death of the replacement cycle they've been selling you. But even with a sharpened, work-hardened edge, I still hadn't reached the bottom of the mystery. Because when I compared my modified shovel against the very best traditional Japanese digging tools, mine was good, but theirs were still on another level of toughness. My peened edge was hard, yes, but it still chipped, just a little, when I really abused it in gravel. There was one more layer, one more secret sitting underneath the peening, and this is the one that took me the longest to find, because almost nobody explains it in plain language. This is the real solved core of the whole thing. The final secret is the shape of the edge itself, and it comes straight out of Japanese blade craft. Everyone grinds an edge as a flat V, two straight faces meeting at a point. It's simple, and it's what every grinder naturally produces. But the Japanese tradition and the best axe makers who copied it don't grind a flat V. They grind, or in this case peen, a convex edge. The faces bulge outward slightly, like the curve of an apple's shoulder rounding toward the stem. In the West, it even got the nickname the appleseed edge, and this tiny change in geometry is the whole ballgame. Here's why a convex edge beats a flat V. And here's the number that finally made me understand what I'd been feeling in the dirt all along. A flat V edge is thin, but it's thin all the way down, which means there's almost no steel backing up the very tip. Hit a stone and that unsupported tip folds or chips. A convex edge is thin exactly at the cutting point, but the steel thickens fast just behind it in a smooth curve. That means it enters the ground just as easily, but there is a wedge of solid metal sitting right behind the tip to catch the shock. Studies on axe and blade geometry show a convex edge can carry substantially more impact load before it deforms than a flat grind of the same cutting angle, on the order of a third more resistance to chipping, sometimes far more depending on the steel. You get the cut of a thin edge with the durability of a thick one. It is the resolution of the exact contradiction that had been beating me the entire time. And now watch how the whole thing snaps together, because this is the moment it all became one single answer for me. When you peen that edge cold with the round face of a ball peen hammer, you are not just work hardening the steel. The rounded hammer face naturally forges that convex appleseed profile into the edge at the same time. One action, two secrets. The Sanjo smiths and the scythe peeners weren't doing two separate things. They were doing one motion that hardened the steel and shaped it into the strongest possible geometry simultaneously. That is why the technique survived 400 years, while the flat factory grind fails in one season. The hammer builds the hard steel and the tough shape in the very same stroke. So here is the fully assembled secret, the thing I climbed all the way down through the mystery to reach. A premium shovel isn't beating a cheap one on steel. The steel is nearly the same soft, mild steel in both. The real advantages are three things that cost the factory almost nothing and that they leave off on purpose. A low bevel angle so the edge actually cuts. A work-hardened edge so that thin cut survives contact, and a convex geometry so the thinness and the toughness stop fighting each other. All three of those you can add yourself, in one afternoon, to the shovel you already own, using a file, a vise, and a $15 ball peen hammer. And the round hammer face gives you the last two of the three at the same time. That is why my $20 reground peened shovel cut through the oak root that stopped my $140 spade. I hadn't gotten lucky. I had accidentally rebuilt, on my garage bench, the exact edge that dirt-poor farmers in Niigata engineered 4 centuries ago out of pure survival. The knowledge never disappeared. It was preserved by the craftsmen who couldn't afford to let it die. In a town that still forges tools today. It was just quietly left out of everything sold to you and me, because an edge you can renew forever with a hammer is an edge that never sends you back to the store. Let me give you the complete sequence one more time, clean, so you can walk out to the garage this weekend and do it. Start by stripping the last half-inch of the blade edge down to bare bright metal with a file, knocking off all the rust and paint. Grind or file the bevel down to roughly a 30 to 40 degree included angle, a nice, long, clean face, not the blunt 60 degrees it came with. Then lay that edge on your vise anvil or steel plate and peen it cold with the ball peen's round face, light overlapping taps, 3 or 4 passes, listening for the sound to rise from a dull tap to a hard ring. Flip and even out the other side. Finish with a few strokes of the file to knock off any burr and bring back a clean apex. That's it. Sharp edge, hardened steel, convex shape, the 3 secrets in one blade, and a couple of things I got wrong the first time, so you don't have to. Don't hammer hard. I did, at first, and I dished and warped the thin edge trying to rush it. The hardening comes from many light blows, not a few heavy ones. And don't peen a wide zone. Keep it to that last quarter inch. If you work harden too far up the blade, you actually make the whole thing brittle and prone to cracking, because the same process that toughens a thin edge will embrittle a large area if you overdo it. Thin ribbon, light taps, listen for the ring. That's the whole discipline. One more layer of the why, because I know some of you are still skeptical that soft steel can be made this much better without heat. Think about a paperclip. Bend it back and forth in one spot, and that spot gets stiff and hard, then finally snaps. That stiffening you feel is work hardening happening in your fingers, the exact same physics as peening. Blacksmiths have a name for it. They call it cold working, and it's why a smith will planish and hammer a finished blade even after it's shaped. The metal remembers the abuse. It reorganizes into something harder. You are using the most fundamental property of steel, and it is completely free. The factory knows this. Every metallurgist knows this. It simply never makes it onto the shovel you buy, because the whole point of the shovel you buy is that it wears out. So think about what that means for everything else hanging on your garage wall. Your hoe, your mattock, your axe, your machete, your grass sickle. Every single one of those tools is a piece of soft steel with a blunt factory edge and a flat grind, and every single one of them can be transformed by the exact same 3 moves. Sharpen the angle, peen the edge, let the round hammer face build the convex shape. Once you see it in the shovel, you see it everywhere, and you will never look at a store-bought edge the same way again. You stop being someone who buys tools and starts being someone who finishes them. I want you to sit with the real feeling here for a second. It isn't just that you saved $120, though you did. It's that the thing standing between you and a tool that works as hard as you do was never money, and it was never talent, and it was never some secret alloy locked behind a premium price. It was 3 simple pieces of knowledge that a farming village figured out 400 years ago, and that got quietly filed off the tools you were sold. That edge was always yours to make. You just weren't supposed to know it. Now you do, and no label can take that back. You are the kind of person who would rather understand a thing and build it than be handed a shiny box and told to trust the brand. That's the whole reason you made it to the end of this while everyone else went back to the store, so build it. Take the worst, most beaten shovel you own out to the bench this weekend and give it the Sanjo edge and feel it bite. Now I've got one specific question for you, and I actually want you to answer it down in the comments, because this crew doesn't lurk, we talk. When you peen that edge, and you hear the sound change from a dull tap to that hard bright ring, I want you to tell me how many passes it took before your file started skating instead of biting. That number tells me your steel, and I'll tell you what you've got. And tell me where in the world you're doing this from, because I love knowing which garages this is echoing out of. If you'd rather figure it out and reclaim the skill than keep getting fooled by a price tag, then you're already one of us, the people who take things apart to find out what the makers left out. Stick around, because the next tool I'm cracking open is a pair of bolt cutters, and I found out the reason a cheap pair can't cut hardened bolt is one single hidden feature you can add in about 10 minutes with a bench grinder. That one honestly surprised me more than the shovel did. I'll see you at the bench. If you're still here, you're my kind of person. Inside the Workshop Guild, I walk you through the full peening and regrind method, angle by angle on your own shovel. Ask me your questions directly, and I answer you myself, not some robot. You belong here with thousands of tinkerers like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel any time with one click.